June Hatfield had $214 in her checking account and 11 days until the electric bill was due. Not 11 days until things might turn around. 11 days until the lights went out in the house where her 13-year-old son did his homework at the kitchen table and her mother slept in the back room with a fan running all night because the heat in Savannah, Georgia in September does not ask permission before it comes inside. June was 41 years old. She worked the breakfast and lunch shift at Caldwell's Diner on Oglethorpe Avenue, Tuesday through Saturday, 6 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon, and she had been doing it for 9 years. The tips were honest, the hours were predictable, the pay was not enough, and everyone involved understood that. Her son Owen was 13 and mostly good. He had his father's jaw and June's stubborn streak, and a way of absorbing the tension in a room without ever showing that he'd felt it, which was the thing about him that kept her up some nights more than the electric bill did. Her mother, Iris, was 73. She had come to live with June 2 years ago after the fall in her apartment in Macon. Not a bad fall, a bad enough one. The kind that changes the math. June had driven 4 hours on a Thursday, packed 2 suitcases and a box of photographs, and driven 4 hours back, and they had not spoken about it as sacrifice because it was not. It was just what came next. That was the household. 3 people, 1 income, 11 days. It was a Wednesday in late September. Overcast, the air still holding the last of the summer heat even though the calendar had said otherwise for 3 weeks. June came home from her shift at 2:20. She turned the corner onto Drayton Street and saw the woman sitting on the front porch steps. Old, very old. Small in the way that people get when years start subtracting instead of adding. A gray coat that was wrong for the weather, buttoned to the throat, no bag, no purse, nothing in her hands except a small ceramic figurine, a blue bird, held in both palms the way you hold something fragile or sacred or both. June pulled into the driveway and sat in the car for a moment. The woman had not looked up. She was looking at the figurine in her hands the way a person looks at something they have been looking at for a very long time. June got out of the car. She said, "Can I help you?" The woman looked up. Her eyes were clear. Whatever else age had done to her, it had not touched her eyes. She said, "I'm looking for the Clement Street shelter. Someone told me it was near here." Her voice was careful, unhurried, not the voice of someone who expected to be helped. June knew the Clement Street shelter. She also knew it had closed intake at noon. It was 2:30 in the afternoon. She told the woman that. The woman nodded once, the way people nod when they had suspected as much. She said, "Thank you." She began to push herself up from the step, slowly, one hand flat on the concrete, the other still holding the figurine. June watched her stand, watched her turn toward the sidewalk and take 1 step, then 2. The September heat pressed down on everything. The woman's coat was buttoned to the throat. She walked with the deliberate pace of someone whose body had started charging more than it used to for every movement. June said, "Hey." The woman stopped. She did not turn right away. June said, "One night, we have a couch." The woman turned. She looked at June for a moment, not with gratitude, not with relief, but with something quieter than both. Something like recognition of a thing she had almost stopped expecting. She came back up the steps. Her name was Harriet Odom. She said it once, standing just inside the threshold, not moving further until June moved first. June showed her to the living room couch, brought out a blanket from the hall closet, and set a glass of water on the side table. Harriet sat down slowly. She placed the bluebird figurine on the cushion beside her. Then she lay back, and even as her breathing slowed into sleep, one hand remained on the figurine. Her fingers curled around it loosely. She held it the way you hold something that is less about the object and more about the keeping of it. June's mother Iris appeared in the hallway. She looked at the woman asleep on the couch. She looked at June. June said, "She had nowhere to go." Iris looked at the couch again. She said, "What's her name?" June said, "Harriet." Iris nodded slowly, the way someone nods when they are deciding whether or not to say the other thing. She didn't say it. She went back to her room. June locked the front door. She checked on Owen. She went to bed and lay in the dark and did not sleep for a long time, not because she was afraid exactly, but because she was a woman alone with a teenage son and an elderly mother, and she had just let a stranger in off the street, and the part of her that had learned to be careful was still standing at the front door, still watching, still not fully persuaded that the part of her that had called the woman back was right. Both parts were hers. She let them argue until exhaustion settled it. She woke at 6 to get ready for her shift. The living room was quiet. The blanket on the couch was folded into a neat rectangle at one end. The glass of water had been rinsed and set upside down on a dish towel on the kitchen counter. Harriet was at the kitchen table. She had a pen and was writing something on the back of a grocery store receipt she must have found on the counter. She looked up when June came in. She said, "I didn't want to use paper without asking. I hope this is all right." June said, "What are you writing?" Harriet said, "A list. For your garden." June said, "I don't have a garden." Harriet said, "I know. That's what the list is for." She held up the receipt. On the back, in small careful handwriting, were the names of 6 plants. Beside each one, a single line about soil or sun or spacing. June stood in the kitchen looking at the list. She had a small strip of dirt along the side of the house that she had always meant to do something with and never had. She poured 2 cups of coffee. She sat down across from Harriet. Owen came in from the hallway, still in his sleep shirt, and stopped when he saw Harriet. He said, "Who are you?" Harriet said, "Harriet, and you?" He said, "Owen." She said, "Owen, good name. Solid." Owen seemed to consider this with the seriousness it apparently deserved. He sat down and ate cereal and did not say much else, but he did not leave either. June drove to work with the receipt in her apron pocket. She did not know what she was going to do with it. She did not know what she was going to do with Harriet. She left her a key on the table. June Hatfield grew up 20 miles outside of Augusta, in a town that had 2 stoplights and a volunteer fire department and a Wednesday farmers market that shut down by noon. Her father sold insurance for 31 years from a desk in a building on Broad Street, and coached Little League on Saturdays in a baseball cap that he wore until it fell apart. He was the kind of man who remembered everyone's name, not as a skill, as a conviction. He believed that a person's name was the first thing you owed them. He died when June was 17, an aneurysm, 3 days after her birthday, a Tuesday. The kind of death that doesn't give you time to prepare because it doesn't give you time at all. Her mother went back to work the following week at the school district office in Augusta, where she had worked for 11 years. She did not make a speech about it. She ironed her blouse and went. June watched her from the kitchen and understood something without being able to name it yet. Something about the relationship between grief and motion. About how sometimes the only way through a thing was to keep doing the ordinary things while the thing was happening to you. Her mother had a saying she used when one of the kids complained about inconvenience, or when the neighbor's dog got into the yard again, or when the church potluck needed 3 more people to volunteer and nobody wanted to be the one who said yes. She would say it quietly, without drama. She would say, "The hardest thing to give is the thing you can't spare. That's the only kind of giving that counts." June had heard it so many times, it had stopped being words, and had become just a part of the air in that house. She carried it the way you carry something that is so familiar, you forget you're carrying it. She moved to Savannah at 23, married Daniel Hatfield at 27. Owen came at 28. The marriage was not mean or violent. It was something quieter and harder to name. 2 people who had once understood each other and then slowly stopped, not through cruelty but through accumulation. Small distances that nobody addressed until they had become the whole relationship. Daniel moved to his brother's place in Charleston when Owen was 10. He sent money every month. June cashed the checks and did not call to discuss it, because there was nothing to discuss that hadn't already been not discussed for 3 years. She picked up extra shifts. She learned which tables tipped and which didn't, which regulars wanted the coffee hot and which wanted it warm, how to carry 4 plates without using a tray, because tray service was slow and slow service was money she didn't have. 9 years at Caldwell's and she was good at the job the way you get good at something when there is no option of not being good at it. She was not the kind of person who let strangers in. She had a son to think about. A mother. A margin that did not tolerate surprises. And then a woman sat down on her front steps in a coat buttoned to the throat in September heat with a blue bird figurine held in both hands. The second morning, June came home from her shift at 2015, and the strip of dirt along the side of the house was turned. Not planted. Turned. The soil broken up. The weeds cleared. The clumps broken apart the way a gardener breaks ground before planting. Methodical, patient, the way you do it when you have done it many times and know that the preparation is most of the work. Harriet was washing her hands at the kitchen sink. She didn't say anything about the garden. June didn't ask. The third morning, June noticed that the back door, which had not latched properly for 2 years because the frame had shifted and the bolt no longer lined up, clicked shut cleanly when she tested it. She stood at the door and tried it 3 times. It caught every time, firm and even. She went to the living room. Harriet was reading a paperback she had found on the shelf, her reading glasses low on her nose. June said, "The back door." Harriet said, "The frame was swollen. I let it air out, then reset the strike plate. It's a simple fix if you catch it early." June said, "How did you?" Harriet said, "My husband built houses. I watched for 42 years. You learn things whether you mean to or not." She turned a page. June went to make lunch. The fourth day, Owen came home from school to find Harriet at the kitchen table with a grid drawn on paper and a stack of library books on container gardening borrowed from his backpack without asking, which he seemed to consider an acceptable trade. He sat down across from her, and they talked for 2 hours about drainage and companion planting, and whether you could grow tomatoes in Savannah heat in October if you chose the right variety, which Harriet said you could. June stood in the hallway and watched her son lean forward over a hand-drawn planting grid, asking questions and listening to the answers with his whole body, and felt something shift in her chest that she could not immediately identify. She had been saying you should find somewhere for 5 days. She stopped saying it on the 4th evening. She had not decided Harriet could stay. She had just stopped using the words that meant leave. Her coworker at Caldwell's, a woman named Patricia, noticed something the following Tuesday morning. June had been staying an extra few minutes with the older regulars. Mr. Kavanaugh, who came in every day and always ordered the same thing, and always told the same 3 stories, the ones about his Navy, years that everyone behind the counter had heard enough times to recite. June had been sitting down with him. Not long. 5 minutes. Long enough to hear the story again and respond to it like it was the first time. Patricia said, "You're different with the regulars lately." June said, "Different how?" Patricia said, "Slower, like you're not trying to get to the next thing." June said, "I'm just being polite." Patricia said, "That's not what it looks like." June didn't explain. She didn't need to. She just thought about an old woman at her kitchen table drawing, planting grids with her son, and she understood that something had changed in the way she was seeing the people around her. Every older face in the diner. Every pair of hands that shook slightly when reaching for a coffee cup. Every person eating alone who looked up when someone came in the door. She did not name what had changed. She just stayed 5 more minutes with Mr. Kavanaugh and listened to the Navy story one more time. The phone call came on a Thursday. June was at the diner, between the breakfast and lunch rushes, re-rolling silverware at the counter. The number was a 706 area code, Augusta. A man's voice. Measured, professional. He said, "I'm trying to reach a June Hatfield. I'm calling about Harriet Odom." June set down the fork she was rolling. She said, "Who is this?" He said, "My name is Thomas Odom. I'm Harriet's son." A pause that told June several things before he said the next sentence. He said, "She's been gone for 3 weeks. We've been looking. A neighbor said she was asking about shelters in Savannah." June said, "She's been staying with me. She's fine." Thomas was quiet, not surprised quiet. The tired quiet of someone who had received versions of this news before and had stopped knowing how to feel about them. He said, "She does this. She leaves. She's been doing it since my father passed. She finds a place to be useful, and she stays until she thinks she's become a burden. Then she goes again." June said, "She hasn't been a burden." He said, "I know she hasn't. That's not actually her concern." He was quiet a moment. Then he said, She has vascular dementia, early to moderate. She has good days and she has other days. She has medication she takes inconsistently. She has a neurologist in Augusta she has not seen in 8 months. June said nothing. He said, I'm not asking you to manage this. I just need you to know what you're dealing with. She won't tell you herself. She would rather you think she chose to leave than admit that she sometimes doesn't remember choosing. June stood at the counter with the phone against her ear and looked through the diner window at Oglethorpe Avenue, at the familiar afternoon light on the familiar street, and felt the ground of the last week shift slightly under everything she had understood it to be. Thomas said, if she seems confused, or if she tries to leave at night, please call me. He gave her a number. She wrote it on the back of her order pad. She said, she seemed clear. She knew where she was. She knew my name after I said it once. Thomas said, she has good days. This has apparently been a good stretch. Those are the cruelest ones in some ways. They let you forget what you're watching. June went home that afternoon and sat on the porch and listened to the sounds from inside. Her mother's television in the back room. Owen talking to someone on the phone in a low voice, the way teenagers talk when they don't want to be overheard. Harriet in the kitchen. The soft sounds of a pot being set on a burner. She sat and did not go inside for a while. She thought about the back door and the planting grid and the list of 6 plants and the way Harriet had held the blue bird in her sleep. She thought about Thomas's voice on the phone. The particular tired quality of someone who loves a person they cannot keep safe. She went inside. Harriet was making something with onions and broth. It smelled like the inside of October. June said, do you remember the shelter, the one you were looking for? Harriet said, without turning from the stove, Clement Street, yes. June said, do you remember why you were looking for it? Harriet was quiet. She stirred the pot. She said, I remember that I was tired and the coat was too warm and you had a very nice porch. June said, Thomas called. Harriet stopped stirring. She did not turn around for a long moment. She said, he worries. June said, so do I. Another long silence. The pot simmered. Harriet set the spoon down on the rest June had put next to the stove. She said, I was a high school librarian for 34 years in Augusta. My husband built homes. We raised 2 children in a house with a garden on Knowbrook Avenue. I have been a useful person my entire life. She picked up the spoon again. I'm still useful. I just need people to let me be. June leaned in the doorway. She said, I know. Harriet said, he wants me in a facility. June said, he wants you safe. Harriet said, those are not always the same thing. She was not wrong. Neither of them said anything else about it. Owen had a science project due. He mentioned it at dinner without looking up from his plate, the way he mentioned things that he needed help with but did not want to admit he needed help with. Harriet asked what the project was. He said it was a plant growth experiment. But he had started it too late and the control seedlings were not going to have time to establish before the due date. Harriet said, what kind of seedlings? He told her. She said, come here after dinner. They were at the kitchen table until 9:30. June watched from the living room as Harriet walked Owen through propagation timing and how to document irregular data and what to write in his methodology when the timeline hadn't gone the way you planned. She said, science isn't about perfect results. It's about accurate records of what actually happened and an honest explanation of why. That's harder to do than getting it right the first time. Owen wrote that down. June stood in the doorway of the living room, listening to a 70-something-year-old woman with vascular dementia explain the nature of honest documentation to her 13-year-old son on a Wednesday night in Savannah, Georgia, and thought about her father saying that a person's name was the first thing you owed them. She thought about what else you owed them, whether it stopped at the name. The sound came at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday, not loud. A door and then footsteps, slow and deliberate, not trying to be quiet. June was out of bed before she had finished waking up. The front door was open, not wide, just open. Harriet was on the porch. She was fully dressed, coat buttoned, the blue bird in both hands. She was looking at the street with the focused attention of someone who is looking for something and is not yet sure they are in the right place. June stepped onto the porch. She did not turn on the light. She did not call out. She sat down on the top step, next to where Harriet was standing. Harriet did not startle. She looked down at June. She said, "I was going." June said, "Where?" A long pause. Harriet looked at the street again. She said, "I'm not sure anymore." She said it the way you say something true that costs you something. June said, "Come sit down." Harriet sat. June sat next to her. The night was cooler than September had any right to be. A car passed on Drayton. Somewhere down the block someone's wind chime moved. Harriet said, "There are nights I know exactly where I am, and there are nights the knowing comes and goes. This is a coming and going night." June said, "I know." Harriet looked at her. She said, "Thomas told you." June said, "Yes." Harriet looked at the figurine in her hands. She said, "My husband gave this to me the year we were married, 1974. We were in Gatlinburg on a trip, and I saw it in a shop window and I said I liked it, and then I forgot about it. And on our anniversary he had gone back and bought it. He drove back. We had already driven 4 hours home." June said nothing. Harriet said, "He kept it in his coat pocket the whole drive back so it wouldn't break. He said he was afraid to put it in the bag in case it got jostled." She held it up slightly, looking at it. She said, "I have held this every night since he died. Not because I need to. Because it's the shape my hands remember." June put her arm around Harriet's shoulder. It was a small gesture and a large one, and it was the truest thing she had to offer. She said, "Let's go inside." Harriet let her. June walked her to the couch, set the blanket over her, put the figurine on the cushion where her hand could reach it. Harriet closed her eyes. June sat on the chair across from the couch until she heard Harriet's breathing slow to sleep. Then she went back to bed and did not sleep for a long time. She called Thomas in the morning. The morning Harriet left, June came home from her shift to a couch that was made with a specific and deliberate precision, a precision that had nothing to do with habit and everything to do with intention, the kind of care you take with something you are not coming back to. Harriet was by the door with the gray coat on and the blue bird in her hand. No bag. She had arrived with nothing. She was leaving with nothing. June stood in the hallway. Harriet said, "Thomas is coming at noon." June said, "I know. I talked to him this morning." Harriet said, "I want to go before Owen gets home from school." June said, "He'll want to say goodbye." Harriet said, "I know." A pause. "That's why I want to go before he's home." She said it with the clean, clear logic of someone who had already done the math on what a goodbye would cost a 13-year-old boy and had decided not to let him pay it. June said, "He's going to notice the garden." Harriet looked at her. June said, "You turned the soil. You made the grid, the list of 6 plants. He's going to want to plant them." Harriet was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The tomatoes will want the east-facing corner. Full morning sun, he'll figure the rest out." She picked up the blue bird. She held it for a moment. Then she held it out toward June. June said, "That's yours." Harriet said, "I want him to have it. Tell him it's better to hold the thing you're afraid to lose than to keep it in a bag where it might get jostled." She paused. "He'll understand when he's older. Or he won't. Either way, tell him." June took the figurine. She stood at the door and watched Thomas help Harriet into the passenger seat of a silver car. Watched him check her seatbelt twice. Watched him look up at June on the porch with an expression that was gratitude and exhaustion, and something else she couldn't quite name from a distance. He raised one hand. She raised hers. The car moved down Drayton Street and turned at the corner and was gone. June went inside. On the side table by the couch was a folded piece of paper. She opened it. The handwriting was careful, even small. It said, "You gave a stranger your threshold. Most people give nothing. Some give directions. You gave the door." She stood in the living room for a long time. Then she folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket, the same pocket where she had been carrying the grocery receipt with the list of 6 plants. She went and looked at the garden bed on the side of the house. The soil was dark and turned and ready. Waiting. Owen came home at 3:15. He dropped his backpack in the hall and went to the kitchen and then stopped. He said, "Where is she?" June said, "She had to go. Her son came for her." Owen looked at the kitchen table. He went to the living room and looked at the couch. June handed him the figurine. He held it in both hands the way Harriet had held it. He didn't say anything for a moment. He said, "What is this?" June told him what Harriet had said, about the shop in Gatlinburg, about the 4-hour drive back, about the coat pocket. Owen turned it over in his hands. He said, "Why did she give it to me?" June said, "She said you'd understand when you're older." Owen looked at it for another moment. Then he said, "Can we plant the tomatoes this weekend?" June said, "Yes." He put the figurine on the windowsill above the kitchen sink, where the morning light came through. Then he sat down at the kitchen table and started his homework. June made coffee. She stood at the sink and looked at the blue bird in the window light. She thought about a woman who built houses and a woman who cleaned houses and the thread that ran between them across decades without either of them knowing it was there. She thought about her mother's saying, "The hardest thing to give is the thing you can't spare." She had not had Harriet's name until the woman said it. She had not had her story. She had had a porch step and an open door. 6 weeks later, on a cold Saturday morning in November, a letter arrived addressed to June Hatfield, with a return address in Augusta. The postmark was 7 days old. Inside was a folded document from an accounting firm and a handwritten note on plain stationery. The note said, "June. Harriet passed quietly on October 28th. She asked me to send this. She prepared it 3 weeks before she came to Savannah. Our attorney said it had been notarized and filed before she left Augusta. She knew what she was doing. She always knew what she was doing. She always knew what she was doing. Thomas." The document was 1 page. It described a savings account in Harriet and Gerald Odom's names, established in 1989. The balance, after medical and administrative fees, was $31,000. The named beneficiary, added to the account 14 months prior to Harriet's death, was June Marie Hatfield, address on Drayton Street, Savannah, Georgia. June read the page. She read it again. She sat down at the kitchen table. She said out loud to the empty kitchen, "I don't understand." Owen came in from the hallway. He looked at her. He said, "What?" She said, "Nothing. Go get your shoes. We're going to the garden store." She waited until he was in his room. She picked up the phone and called Thomas. He answered on the second ring. His voice was tired in the specific way of someone who has been tired for a long time. She said, "Thomas, the letter." He said, "I know." She said, "I can't take this. I kept her for 11 days. I didn't do anything." He said, "She told me what you did." She said, "I gave her a couch and a key." He said, "You gave her 11 days of being a person instead of a problem. You let her fix your door and plan your garden and teach your son about plant biology and be useful and competent and known. Do you have any idea how long it had been since someone let her just be herself?" June was quiet. He said, "She didn't leave because she was confused that night." Well, she was. But the reason she had come to Savannah in the first place. She wasn't lost. She was looking for someone. June said, "She didn't know me." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Her closest friend from Augusta. A woman named Frances Whitmore. Frances moved to Savannah 6 years ago. She passed away 2 winters ago. After that, my mother stopped." He paused. "She stopped being willing to stay in one place. She'd been a librarian for 34 years. She knew how to find things, how to trace connections forward." He said, "Frances Whitmore's daughter, do you know the name?" June said, "No." Thomas said, "Her married name was Hatfield. She lived on Drayton Street. She died 4 years ago. You bought the house from her estate." The kitchen was very quiet. June said, "I bought this house from a woman named Carol Hatfield. I never met her." Thomas said, "Carol was Frances's daughter. My mother had been in that house many times. She knew the address. She knew that house was the last place her closest friend had been happy. And when she found out what the name on the deed was now, when she saw the name Hatfield on Drayton Street, he stopped. I don't know if it was reason or instinct at that point. Maybe both, maybe neither. But she chose your door. June sat at the kitchen table looking at the document in her hand. She thought about Carol Hatfield, a woman she had never met, who had lived in this house before her and died in it or near it and left it behind. She thought about Frances Whitmore, who had been in this kitchen, probably at this table, probably drinking coffee the way people do in kitchens that feel like home. She thought about a library in Augusta where a woman had worked for 34 years and learned the shape of every kind of connection that can exist between people and the records they leave behind. She thought about what Thomas had said, that his mother always knew what she was doing. She said, "Does this make what she did fair? She came to my door for a reason I didn't know. She let me think she was a stranger." Thomas said, "I've been asking myself that since she told me. I keep coming back to the same thing. She watched you not know any of it. She watched you give your couch and your key and your kitchen and your time, and she watched you never ask for anything back. And she decided that was who you were, that the reason didn't change the thing." June said, "It changes something." Thomas said, "Yes," he said. "It changes everything about the story. It doesn't change what you did." After the call, June sat for a while longer. She looked at the blue bird on the windowsill. The morning light had moved and it was in shadow now. But she could still see the color of it, that particular blue that holds more light than it should. She went to Owen's room and knocked and said, "Ready." He came out with his jacket on and his shoes untied the way he always was, always the shoes. She drove to the garden store. She bought the 6 plants from the list on the receipt, 2 varieties of tomato, basil, 1 pepper plant, marigolds for the borders because Harriet had written beside them, "Keep the beetles off," and a small climbing vine for the fence she hadn't known she was going to put up until she bought the vine. Owen carried them to the car in 2 trips, careful with each one, setting them upright in the footwell of the back seat. On the drive home, he said, "Do you think she knew she wasn't coming back when she left?" June thought about the figurine held in a coat pocket for 4 hours so it wouldn't get jostled. She said, "I think she always knew what she was doing." Owen looked out the window. He said, "I'm going to do the east corner for the tomatoes." She said, "Morning sun." June said, "I know, she told me." They planted on Sunday. June's mother Iris came out and sat in a lawn chair on the small patio and watched and handed things when asked. Owen followed the planting grid Harriet had drawn on the back of the grocery receipt, the one June had smoothed out and taped to a piece of cardboard to keep it from tearing. They worked through the afternoon. The soil was already turned and ready. When they finished, Owen stood back and looked at the garden bed, at the small green plants standing in their places in the turned earth. He went inside and came back with the blue bird and set it at the edge of the garden, in the corner near the tomatoes where the morning sun would hit it first. He didn't explain. June didn't ask. They stood there together for a minute in the late afternoon light, looking at a garden that had been planned by a woman who was no longer there and would grow without her, the way things do when the preparation has been done with enough care. Harriet Odom is not a real person, but she is not far from one. In the United States, there are more than 5 million people living with Alzheimer's disease or a related dementia. Nearly half of them live alone or with limited support. Many of them are women over 70 who spent decades as teachers, librarians, nurses, mothers, the people who kept records and remembered names and showed up without being asked, who built things and tended things and held things together. And then a spouse died, or the children moved, or the brain began quietly rewriting the terms of the lease without telling anyone. The fastest growing population in American homeless shelters is adults over 60. Many of them do not look the way most people picture homelessness. They are dressed. They are polite. They carry something small in their hands that they will not put down. What June did, opening her door, is not something anyone should feel required to do. There is real risk in any open door. This story does not argue otherwise. But what Harriet needed was not a facility or a file or a case number. She needed 11 days of being a person with a name, someone to drink coffee across from, a boy who wanted to know about tomatoes. A door that opened without requiring her to explain herself first. There are small things. Knowing the shelter hours and what happens to people when intake closes. Checking on the neighbor who lives alone. Learning the name of the person everyone else passes without stopping. Not because it fixes the system, because it might fix the day. And for someone running low on days that feel like their own, that is not a small thing. Some people will say June made the right call. She listened to something older than fear, and she opened the door, and a woman who had been known and competent and loved her whole life got to be those things for 11 more days. And a garden grew from it, and a boy learned something that will take him years to name. And a piece of an old connection between two households was honored, without anyone planning to honor it. That is the generous reading. It is not wrong. Others will say she was reckless. A son in the house. A mother to protect. A stranger with an illness she hadn't disclosed, coming to a door for reasons she hadn't shared. In a different version of this story with a different stranger, the ending is not the same. That reading is not wrong either. And then there is Harriet, who left a balance on an account and had it notarized 3 weeks before she knocked. Who chose that door on that street because she knew what was connected to it, and then she watched to see what June would do when she didn't know any of that. Who held back the reason so the kindness would be free of it. Was that fair? Is it a test if you never agreed to take it? Or is that just what the world is? A long series of moments where someone is watching what you do when no one is keeping score, and you don't find out until later that someone was. That question doesn't have one answer. It has yours. This story is fiction. Harriet and June and Owen and the house on Drayton Street, none of them are real in the way that can be looked up, but the data is real. The 5 million people with dementia are real. The women in gray coats sitting on porch steps in the wrong season heat are real. The women in gray coats sitting on porch steps in the wrong season heat are real. The grown children doing the best they can across impossible distances are real. I wrote this because once I sat next to an elderly woman on a bus in November who was holding a small ceramic figurine in both hands and staring at the window. We rode for 40 minutes. She did not speak. I did not speak. When she got off, I watched through the glass and I did not know if she knew where she was going. I have thought about her since. I think about what one question would have cost me, what her name was, whether she was going somewhere or just riding. I don't know. But I wrote this to imagine what might have been in the hands of a stranger I chose not to know, and what it might have meant if I had chosen otherwise. If this one stayed with you, share it with someone who might need it today. New stories every week on Mara's Story. We'll see you in the next one. I keep thinking about the blue bird on the windowsill, the way Owen carried it outside and set it in the corner of the garden without explaining himself. He just knew where it belonged. That's the thing I come back to most when I think about this story. Not the money, not the letter from the attorney's office or the account that had June's name on it for over a year before Harriet ever knocked on her door. I come back to a 13-year-old boy placing a ceramic bird in the dirt next to a tomato plant. Because somewhere in the 11 days he had spent with an old woman at a kitchen table, he had understood something about tending things. About the relationship between care and growth. About what it means to put something where the light can reach it. June didn't open her door because she knew it would work out. She opened it because she recognized something. A woman in the wrong coat for the weather, holding the only thing she had not let go of in years, looking for a place that had already closed. June had spent 9 years learning which customers wanted hot coffee and which wanted warm, learning how to carry 4 plates without a tray because slow was expensive. She had learned to read the room. And she read that porch step, and she made a call that her careful, stretched, 11 days until the electric bill life did not technically have room for. That's what I think about when people talk about integrity, not the big dramatic moments, the small ones, the ones where nobody is watching and the cost is real and you do the thing anyway because not doing it would make you someone you don't recognize. June couldn't spare the couch. She gave it. That's the only kind of giving that counts. And it's the only kind that leaves a mark on the world. And Harriet, a woman who had been a librarian for 34 years, which means she spent her life understanding, That information is only useful when it's connected to the right person at the right moment. She didn't wander to Drayton Street. She traced a thread. She used everything she still had: her memory on a good day, her sense of pattern, her lifelong understanding of how connections survive even after the people who made them are gone, and she followed it to a door. That's not confusion. That's a kind of intelligence that doesn't show up on any assessment. And then she watched. She held back the reason and she watched what June did without it. She let the kindness be free of history, free of obligation, free of debt. Because she understood that the only way to know what someone is made of is to see what they do when there's no score being kept. What grew from all of it was not just a garden. It was Owen knowing how to listen to someone older than him. It was June staying 5 extra minutes with the regulars at Caldwell's. It was Iris sitting in a lawn chair handing things when asked. Which is its own kind of showing up. It was a household that had been running on a thin margin, learning that the margin could hold more than it looked like it could. Hard things don't build character by themselves. How you move through them does. June moved through hers by staying open when closing would have been easier and nobody would have blamed her. Harriet moved through hers by remaining useful and curious and deliberate, even when her own mind was renegotiating the terms. Owen moved through his by paying attention to someone who wasn't young and wasn't in a hurry and had something real to say. The tomatoes will come back next year. That's what happens when the soil is prepared by someone who knows what they're doing. You don't have to replant. You just have to not give up on the ground.